Welcome to this fascinating panel. I know that there were a lot of panels already which were quite interesting, and we hope to meet your expectations as well. So this panel will be about carbon financing, offsetting and corporate mitigation strategies. My name is Tom Pfeiffer and I will be the moderator of this panel. So for start, we will have a short video showing Dr. David Nabarro, who will discuss or who will talk about nature-based solutions and the financing gap as well.
Hello and good day. I'm here to talk with you about nature-based solutions in the context of climate action. The focus on nature-based solutions first emerged from work done by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Together with a series of other organizations, they were able to demonstrate that if there was adequate investment in nature through specific activities, which are currently referred to as nature-based solutions, it would be possible to achieve 1/3 of the necessary reductions in greenhouse gases by 2030 in order to contribute to a world where the net increase in temperature is between 1.5 and 2 degrees greater than pre-industrial averages. Just think of it, 1/3. And actually what happened during 2019 was that more and more governments and businesses and popular organizations woke up to the reality that investing in nature-based solutions can be an important part of the overall effort to achieve the proper outcome on climate change. That doesn't mean that there should be a reduction in efforts to decarbonize. Absolutely not. Decarbonising of industry and energy and transport is absolutely critical for nature and for humanity. It doesn't mean there should be any reduction in emphasis on adaptation and resilience, because enabling the hundreds of millions of people whose lives are affected by climate change to withstand that threat is an absolutely key part of planning for the future of people and the planet. But there's a third leg: decarbonisation, adaptation and resilience, and investing in nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions means everything to do with terrestrial ecosystems. It means freshwater-based systems. It means marine and ocean systems. And it means food and agriculture systems, as well as action to reduce the biodiversity crisis. Bringing them all together and referring to them as nature-based solutions was something that was really considered to be essential for the 2019 Climate Action Summit that took place in New York on September the 23rd. In preparing for that summit, China and New Zealand took the lead on developing a manifesto titled Nature-Based Solutions for Climate Action, making the point that a major scale-up in nature is key, but that it involves valuing nature as key to the well-being of people and the planet, putting a value on nature right across all sectors, enabling all of society to be involved. That's fine, that's good. The message got across. More than 35 countries within a month came in saying, we're going to support this manifesto. And there were huge events throughout New York that were actually recognizing that there is a deep relationship between investing in nature and successful action on climate. But it goes a lot further. Nature-based solutions can contribute to maintenance of biodiversity, better rural employment, much more sustainable systems for agriculture, plus nutritious diets that are good for us all. Nature-based solutions have benefits that go beyond climate action. They are good in their own right. And so the conversation moves to thinking about nature-based living, nature-based sustainable development, nature into everything, but in a way that doesn't say we're going to just preserve nature and conserve it, turning everything back to the wild, but saying that actually, yes, everybody's livelihoods depend in some way or other on nature, some of course more than others, but that means respecting nature, not treating the atmosphere or the sea or waterways as dustbins, not destroying forests which are key to carbon sequestration, but actually valuing nature. Let's consider what the value can be. 12 gigabytes of carbon sequestered through nature in the coming years. Wonderful. But there's a problem, and that is that out of all spending on climate, despite the fact that 30% of the solution could come through nature, only 3% of climate spending goes on nature-based solutions. And that's not because of a lack of evidence. It's simply because the mechanisms don't exist. Yes, the Green Climate Fund and the GEF have been moving money into nature using much better land-based and water-based planning. But it's just not enough. And actually getting the money to where it's needed is particularly difficult. And that's where there are real possibilities, because those who are currently emitting carbon dioxide do need to offset their emissions during the process while they are actually shifting to low carbon alternatives. And it's that offsetting funding that could be key to supporting nature through nature-based credits that are truly jurisdictional, properly monitored, additional and not simply double counted, and contributing to the increase in finance available for nature. I hope that you have a very good meeting discussing these options, and I look forward to hearing your results. Thanks very much indeed for the chance to be with you today.
So you were listening to David Nabarro. He's co-facilitator of Nature-Based Solutions for UN Climate 2019. Now, having heard his opinion on nature-based solutions and the financing, we want to feel a bit the temperature in this room as well about what you feel about offsetting. So for that, we will use Slido, and Florian will show you or you will see on your application the question.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know how I get the questions on the screen, but at least we have the password on the screen, and you should see the questions on your mobile phones.
There we go.
Thank you.
Okay. I thought we were in a friendly environment, but well, I mean, still friendly environment, and the other answers are certainly as well pertinent. So let's come to our panelists that I will introduce. So first, I would like to ask Bernard Giraud to meet me on the stage. We want to ask every panelist one question first, and you have either one word, and if one word is not sufficient, you have one sentence. So the question is, when you think of carbon financing and offsetting, what matters most?
Well, I think I see it as an opportunity.
I see it as an opportunity for financing the transition, but an opportunity with risk, especially from a market point of view, and for the investors who are engaging in this journey. And I think one of the issues we can discuss is how we can protect investors and buyers from the uncertainties of the carbon market, especially based on the recent history of carbon.
Okay, so let's introduce also Katarina Kolasiova, and the same question. So what do you think of carbon finance and offsetting, and what matters most in a sentence or a word?
Hello, hi, good afternoon to everyone. I would just say challenge in order to make the carbon market, at least the voluntary carbon market work, make it credible and trustworthy for everyone to go on forward and ensure the financing.
Okay. Gabriel Labatte, welcome to the stage as well. What are your 2 words you want to share with us about what matters most?
When I hear the word offsetting, I think about something that is a transitional, stopgap measure, and a great opportunity at the same time. But it has to be transitional, it has to be a stopgap measure. If we find ourselves in 2035 having offsetting as a main avenue of action, is because we are in troubles.
Okay, interesting. And finally, Louis Redshaw, and his 2 words on what matters most.
So my 2 words are trust and transparency.
Good. So now we have, well, we are asking one question to every panelist, and some of you will have a small presentation with a couple of slides. Some of you will just, answer to the question, in fact. So let's start with Bernard. So first of all, congratulations. You announced this morning for the 3rd Livelihoods Carbon Fund. And with all your experience that you have, we were wondering what you think are the main challenges of carbon offsetting.
Well, maybe first, thank you for inviting me. Just a few words to explain what is the livelihoods model. In fact, we started from the needs of companies that are engaged in reducing their carbon footprint. So they have increasingly set up targets of carbon neutrality. Not all of them, but a growing number. So on the one hand, they are reducing their carbon footprint through their operations, through the transformation of their business models, logistics, packaging, energy, whatever. But at the end of the day, they still have, of course, emissions. So it's a transition thing, and it's also, at the end of the day, there will probably remain a need for offsetting, because they will not come to zero emission when there are huge corporations transporting goods and so on. So we said, okay, how can we provide these companies carbon credit with a true social and environmental value? Those companies have brands. Their reputation is exposed to criticism, and offset is very often criticized. So we need to provide carbon offset which are really undisputable on the fact that they are really improving the lives of people through a sustainable ecosystem. That's what the name of Livelihoods Fund. It's not Carbon Fund, it's Livelihoods Carbon Fund. And we realized that these companies were able to invest equity quite seriously. And instead of just purchasing from the market, they wanted to have a word to say on the choice, on the design of the project, on the real impact of this project. And the first fund was created in 2011, and then we created a second fund in 2017, and this year we are accelerating, creating a third carbon fund. And now we can see that those companies that have invested equity, they get carbon credit at cost, so they also need supply of offset at a competitive cost because they have big volumes. So it's not because the carbon credit are high social value that they should be very, very expensive. So how can we find the right equation of competitive supply of carbon offset with quality? That was the challenge we had. And now we can see that we are able, thanks to their investment, we have 12 corporations having invested quite heavily in our funds, in equity. Now we are in a position where this model can attract financial investors, in a sense that financial investors will get financial profitability, financial return, but they need to be protected from the markets because they cannot take the double risk. On the one hand, the risk that the project fails, and for that we have, of course, diversified our project portfolio, but also the risk of market. Nobody will come in such a market where such an investment where you take the risk of projects which are not so easy in developing countries, and on the other hand, taking the risk that the carbon credit I get from my investment have a higher or very low value depending on the market. So we secure that now with a pre-purchase agreement. So corporations will commit to pre-purchase all the credit that will come from the equity investment from financial investors. In a sense, we secure the supply for the coming years of corporation, and we reduce the equity exposure of corporates through their commitment in purchasing the carbon credit. So this is the model we are now developing to supply the increasing needs. What we realized is after a few years where there were really not so many companies interested in that, if we look at just the past year, there is clearly an acceleration. We are probably at a tipping point where more companies are engaging on climate, taking neutrality objective and commitment, and for that they will need carbon credit. Of course, it will put some pressure on the market, and probably there will be a change in the way we can structure the project and probably the cost of the project as well.
Thank you very much. So let's get to Katarina Kolasiova. She's the head of voluntary carbon markets at Vertis Environmental Finance. And the question we had for her is, from a business perspective, what are the key requirements for a carbon offsetting strategy with high environmental insight?
Hello, good afternoon. After a short technical break here, we are up and running. So my name is Katarina. I work for Vertis Environmental Finance. Our company, we are emissions trading house. So we trade with carbon offsets, emission allowances, energy attributes such as guarantees of origin, and I'm in the business since 2011. I guess compared to the gentleman sitting here on the panel, it's I'm a newbie, but we have approximately 1,300 clients from heavy industry. These are mostly airlines, energy sector, big oil, cement, glass, steel, whatever has a chimney is our at least potential client here in Europe. And what I wanted is to share a little bit of perspective perspective on what matters to our clients while going for offsetting and incorporating the offsetting strategy into their businesses. Now, it's important to address the risks and to really talk openly about why the companies are either not going for offsetting or what do they look behind the strategies of actually doing the offsetting. And from our experience, or based on what we hear from our clients when they come to us, is either they're looking to differentiate their brand, they're looking for compliance, they want to, let's say, satisfy their investors, and all in all, somehow it comes to their profits and appreciation of their brand and their products. Now, offsetting can be, and I believe everyone would agree with me on that one, can be dangerous if not done well. And this is the main point of my presentation. I'm a big believer in carbon offsetting as a matter of bringing finances to the projects where the financing is badly needed for everything, for survival. But then I also believe that things have to be done well so that the entire strategy is credible. So the risks are there. Companies can really get their brands damaged. There can be customers who will not go and buy their products anymore if they discouraged by their not very well done offsetting strategies, and it can have a large, let's say, economical impact on the companies. But in contrary to that, what is the other risk we are looking at? And I think this is important. And in the past 1 month, I had several discussions with credit suppliers that we work with. And companies are asking me that, okay, Katerina, what if we invest in the credits and then the return, or not the return, but the benefit will somehow not reflect? So basically, then the worst thing that can happen is that you invest it in a project that restores land or takes care of avoids the deforestation. And it's important to understand that compared to the corporate risks that we are looking at, there is a much larger risk of not doing that and not having that as one part of your action. So if we look at how should we consider offsetting to make it credible? And here I will just repeat the words of Mr. Navarro from the presentation. Carbon offsetting is a transitional measure, and it should be considered as such, and it should be considered as part of overall strategy of a company. So according to the International Carbon Reduction and Offsetting Alliance organization that is trying to put a bigger, let's say, clarity and transparency into the voluntary carbon market, offsetting should be considered as a part of the cycle where companies measure, reduce, and then offset part of the emissions that are somehow not possible to be reduced anymore or are just way too expensive. So it should be considered as a tool to accelerate the financing for the transitional period. Now, the core of what I would like to mention and the message that I would like to transmit to everyone here in this room and beyond is that today we've heard a lot, and probably we're still going to hear a lot about how to make the projects, the forestry, agricultural, and other projects, how to make them impactful, how to measure the KPIs, how to really have credible projects to choose from. And of course, for corporations, this is important part to choose the right credits, to choose the right projects, the right investments, the right initiatives, but it's not the only one thing that's gonna matter in the end on whether you and me and everyone else is going to judge their initiatives as credible. And I think a lot of times companies are forgetting about this, that it's not only about the type of credit that you buy, but it's also about whether you do the offsetting and you have a decent goal in your company, and you take the offsetting as part of the solutions for higher environmental integrity of your business. It's about whether the amount you offset is actually significant and material enough. We have seen cases when companies actually invested significant, or let's say larger amount of money into carbon offsets or carbon reducing projects, but compared to their impact on the environment of their business, or compared to overall, so the ambition was simply just not significant enough. Another part where companies need to pay attention is whether their efforts on reductions are at least comparable. So offsetting should not be taken as the one thing that's gonna save us, and we throw money on the problem and just save us with offsetting. So they should persist with trying to reduce and mitigate their emissions in-house, and then go for offsetting wherever they cannot reduce. And then, of course, credible suppliers and really investing through funds or companies that can ensure that the money they investing is actually going to the impactful topic and not get disappeared in the market. And the last point I would like to mention, and I think is the most obvious one, is the claims the companies are doing. Yeah, so if you offset 1,000 tons and your impact on environment or footprint is 2 million, you should not overdo it on the self-marketing. Yeah, and this is another very, very typical fail point where usually companies just don't get it. Yeah, so they plant 1,000 trees, God knows what trees, God knows in which environment, and they think they offset their 500,000 tons installation cement and degraded land, and somehow the numbers really don't come in, and then at one point someone finds out, and simply the messaging should be appropriate to the action. Yeah, so these are just few points I wanted to mention, that yes, we all love offsetting, and it can accelerate the speed of us getting where we need to, because it's already 5 past midnight, but companies really should not just think that it's about just the offsets, and should really take serious look on all the other aspects. Otherwise they just set for questions and heat from general public. Yeah, so this is just my contribution. There we go, and that's all.
Thank you, Katarina. Our next speaker will be Louis Redshaw. You are the founder of Redshaw Advisors and have a lot of experience in carbon prices and the markets. So we would like to know from your side what determines the carbon prices in the market for offsets, and can we see a trend for the next few years?
Yeah, and I can try and answer those questions. So my company, Redshaw Advisors, and I personally have been involved in carbon markets for 15 years. I ran Barclays emissions trading business and their other environmental markets activities for 10 of those years, and in that time traded something like 8 billion tons of carbon. And I make no apologies for being a very market-focused person. And when I take a look at the voluntary offsetting market, it fills me with horrors, and I'll explain to you a little bit about that, and really the difficulties that companies face when thinking about offsetting. Now, I've been asked to talk about the voluntary carbon offset markets, and I'm going to run through each of these titles. And the first is offset supply and demand, and I'm going to give you a very simple picture of that. That's supply, cumulative, since 2008, and that's demand. And you can probably work out quite simply that there is more supply than there is demand. And indeed, the total cumulative demand since 2008 sums to something just short of 250 million tonnes. Now, put that in some context, the EU ETS is, and 45% of Europe's emissions are captured by the EU ETS. So it's not as if it's the entire economy. 1.7 billion tonnes per year. So we've got a system here that's completely oversupplied. And that's just VERs from the various standards that are out there. If I included the excess in the system created by CERs, let alone ERUs and AAUs, but just CERs, you could add another couple of billion to the total cumulative oversupply. So we have a market that is completely oversupplied. And the next question is why there's so many different prices for a tonne of carbon in the voluntary market. In the EU emissions trading scheme, you have EU allowances. There's one price across the whole of the EU 28 member states plus 3 additional states that are participating. One price in euros, and everybody knows what that is. But in the voluntary markets, it's quite a different picture. So we have a market where supply outstrips demand, so it's very much a buyer's market. And those buyers have been trained by the various offsetting companies out there to demand different VER characteristics. So one of the points earlier was that VERs should help the Sustainable Development Goals in various ways. But of course, unless every single VER assists every single Sustainable Development Goal the same way, then there's going to be a difference in price right there. And in reality, if we're either carbon offsetting or we're doing something else, the conflating of the two is dangerous if you want to bring some sort of standardization to a market. So the wholesale price of VERs depends on a number of factors, and it's quite a long list. So the first is where it's produced. The next is the technology used to produce it. So it could be renewable energy, it could be forestry, it could be energy efficiency. The next is the quantity bought. So 1 tonne is going to be more expensive than 1 million tonnes per unit. The age of the VER, so older vintage VERs are worth less than a recently produced VER. When I talk about VERs, I'm talking about verified emission reductions, of which there are a variety of types. To continue, the standard used, the offsetting standard. Now under the CDM, there was one standard. It was a certified emission reduction was the carbon credit, and it was the clean development mechanism that produced them. You could have technology differences and country differences, but there was one standard. But under the voluntary markets, there are quite a large number of them. Quite how the process of buying VERs is undertaken affects the price. If you know what you're doing, then you can get a better price than if you don't know what you're doing. The cost of competing offsets. So it's all very well having a renewable energy VER, but you could also have a renewable energy CER or an ERU or indeed a gold standard renewable energy VER. So there's quite a variety of different offsets that if the price of one starts to increase in value and actually become uneconomic, a company can easily just go and get another one that's a bit similar to it, that's cheaper. The sophistication of the buyer, so you know more about the market, you will get a better price. The honesty of the seller, I mean the margin that can be attributed to offset sales can be, frankly, indefensible. And just to take one example, this is the average price in 2016. So the data is quite difficult to come by, and that's another feature of the voluntary markets is getting reliable data. But here's the different carbon standards, and here's the average price of each different carbon standard during 2016. And that's just the carbon standard. You dive into the different technologies, different countries within those, you get an almost infinite variety of prices. So I won't bore you with the details of the average price of all those different things, but the bottom line is it's difficult to assess the price. And that previous graph was the averages. Right? So it wasn't the high and the low. So within each one of those standards, we've got a different price for sometimes the same thing. But that price range in 2018 was 10 cents, dollar cents, to $70 per tonne. That's quite extreme. Difficult thing to trade, you can imagine. So I've talked a little bit about carbon offsetting being decreasingly about actually the carbon part. And that's not really a sensible conclusion from a market standardization point of view. The prices, because of the oversupply, they're too low to incentivize behavior change. So we've got something wrong there too. And the level of trust in offsetting is low. I mean, that's demonstrated by the fact there's something like 50 or 60 million tonnes a year being offset versus 1.7 billion tonnes in only 45% of only the European economy. So it means that everyone out there that's thinking about offsetting, and frankly it doesn't cost very much because each offset's only worth a couple of dollars on average, it means that the people that are thinking about offsetting aren't offsetting, and you've got to ask yourself why. And the reason why is because they're not really sure what to do, whether they should buy one or another type of offset. So and the money flowing to the projects is debatable. You know, how much of that money is going to the offsetter, the person providing the service, and how much is actually going to the project, maybe via one or two intermediaries along the way. So what this should all be about is money going to projects so that we can reduce more emissions. So the market's ripe for a bit of regulation, and most certainly, hopefully you all agree after what I've described, it will definitely benefit from some standardization. Now, getting on to how the market's informed about that pricing, and I've just given you a bunch of numbers, and I've had to do a little bit of digging to get to those. Unfortunately, the market is badly informed about where prices are. So you can get onto multiple online sources, personal offsetting sites. One of the exchanges, CTX, they have a whole load of carbon credits for sale. If you join up, you can get to see what they've got. The UNFCCC has an offsetting website, and that's fantastic. But I can tell you, any offset you find on there, I'll be able to find it cheaper. Because it's not, these are sort of retail prices, and the retail prices vary quite considerably. And therefore there are multiple prices for the same or very similar types of offset, depending on what website you happen to visit. Now, we don't get a lot of transparency in the EU emissions trading scheme, and indeed the California trading scheme, and all the trading schemes, the compliance trading schemes that are out there. You can Google, well, what's the price of this particular carbon allowance, and you'll get the number. It might be 15 minutes delayed, but you'll get the number. Whereas you just can't do that for a voluntary offset. Wholesalers have the best view because they're calling all the projects and finding out how hard a bargain they can drive to get a certain number of offsets. So they know where the price is, but also the biggest opportunity to hide the margin, because if they're the only people that know, they've got their customer has almost no chance of knowing. So as I say, if you've got a more sophisticated buyer, they're going to get a better price than a less sophisticated buyer. So I was also asked to think about the pricing trends of offsets, and it doesn't make for great reading. There's not a lot of data around, but the ecosystem marketplace are the best source. They do a survey each year. They've missed out a couple of years, but there's one coming out, a new one's coming out next week. And they poll their members and they work out what the average price of a VAR is, and that average price is based on wholesale prices mixed in with retail prices, and all the standards all mixed together. But it gives some indication of where that price level is, and it's been dropping, right? And it's been dropping because of the oversupply issue. And if we haven't got the last couple of years, but if I overlay the CER price, bearing in mind CERs are an offset too, there's a very transparent market for CERs, and that's what the CER price is and was. And again, that's a market that is drastically oversupplied. And I've got no qualms to say that the average offset price is going to not have picked up a lot, and in all likelihood will have continued to drift down slowly. That said, things are changing at the moment. Offsetting has become super popular, even in the last couple of months. So, trying to predict the future, well, I'm not going to try and give a price forecast, because I'd have to give you about 2,000 of them, because every price is different depending on supply, demand, and all the other factors I've mentioned. But to have a little, for you all to have a little think about what's on the horizon, and we can all start to imagine what the future may look like for the offsetting market. And what I'm going to do here is just list the impactors on supply and demand, because that's how you get to a price of a carbon credit, and when those impactors may affect the market. And the first one is the Paris Agreement, and in particular Article 6, which is international trading of carbon credits, essentially of offsets that have to be allowed out of a country by the country's government. When's that going to happen? Well, we may get some traction next week. We may not. We always get excited about the prospects of progress at these conferences. Fingers crossed we'll have some clarity on whether the sale of offsets by a country will avoid double counting. So that is, a company in Europe, for example, buying an offset from, say, Kenya, is not taking credit for an offset in addition to the Kenyan government using that offset to count towards its nationally determined contribution. So double counting hopefully gets resolved, but we're not holding our breath just yet. And new regulated markets. Well, the prospect of new regulated markets has taken a bit of a downturn since our friend Donald Trump started rattling people's cages. So in China, for example, were perfectly happy to delay their national emissions trading scheme. Perhaps a coincidence, but since the international competitive issues and trade wars started to pick up, they didn't see necessarily a need to implement that. Now, one of the interesting things about Trump is that trade barriers are okay now, which means that the European Union, for example, is now talking about putting an import tax related to carbon price on goods coming into Europe, which is a most interesting development, which would level the playing field to a degree for European industry. CORSIA, lots of fuss about CORSIA. That's going to come, maybe we'll get the rules in 2020. We've been waiting a long time for the rules of what works in CORSIA, so we don't really know how it's going to affect the market, but I can tell you the first compliance period is 2021 to 2023, 3 years. The true-up period is 2024, and that's a long way away, and the number of tonnes that are expected to be pulled out of the offset market is going to be relatively small, in the tens of millions of tonnes. So that's not going to make the difference, but there's an interesting aspect to CORSIA I'll mention right at the end. The voluntary offsetting market among corporates. Now, there's two very big examples have come up in the last weeks. So Shell's Drive Neutral marketing plan, allows car owners in the UK and the Netherlands, as I understand it, to buy fuel, and Shell's going to buy the offsets for them so they can drive guilt-free and pollute the atmosphere, because they're offsetting with forestry, avoided deforestation, and other credits. And while that might be questionable that drivers of vehicles should think that the problem's been taken care of for nothing, because there's no additional cost if you are a member of Shell's affiliation process, it does bring attention to the concept of offsetting and carbon neutrality. So, and it's a big name, right? And one of the things that's missing from offsetting is trust. So when you get a big brand, as long as they do the job properly, bringing people's attention to carbon offsetting and carbon neutrality, it's not necessarily a bad thing. EasyJet last week said all of their flights are going to be offset, and that created quite a lot of attention and press. And whatever their motives are, they are bringing to the public's attention that carbon's an issue, and that's not a bad thing either. I'm sorry, here we go. And so they're all happening at the moment. And then, interesting problem of, you can't offset everything, because if everybody offsets, who's going to do the emissions reduction? Right? So, but what's interesting at the moment is people are double, triple, possibly even quadruple counting their offsetting activities. Let's take the example of a guy that drives to the airport. Right? He's a very environmentally conscious person, and his family, they've gone and bought some VARs and offset their family's emissions for the year. He drives to the airport via the Shell petrol station, and he buys some carbon neutralised petrol, so he's now offset his journey twice. He gets to the airport, and the airport's trying to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, so they've gone and offset it as well. And then he gets on an EasyJet plane, and that's all been offset. So you have a lot of potential demand, which again isn't a completely bad thing at this stage. We've got a massive oversupply after all. Let's get rid of that, and then the price starts to rise and become meaningful. But we can't double, triple, and quadruple offset forever, so something's got to give. And from my trading background, the simple answer to all of this is to have a price on all carbon. But that's not what I was brought up here to talk about. The adoption of tighter offsetting criteria. Now, this is where CORSIA comes back. So if CORSIA is offsetting the growth in emissions of the aviation sector, they're putting a set of rules on a completely unregulated market, which is the offsetting market. So if those rules are half decent, so they're not just going to let anything in, then it might be, this is me just thinking out loud, it might be that CORSIA sets the offsetting benchmark for offsetting, so the minimum criteria for all offsets. So if CORSIA says, well, you can't use an offset that's older than 3 years, and it has to be renewable or forestry or energy efficiency and nothing else, no large hydro, no industrial gases. If that's what they say, it'd be quite an easy magnet to attract everyone's attention to say, well, actually my standard should look at least like that. It might drag some offsetting standards down, but it might drag the majority up. So that's my sort of fantasy, if you like, that we'll have a indirect regulation of the offsetting market in terms of what counts as a valid offset. So just to summarise, oversupply means that offset prices could well stay depressed for a while. The lack of standardisation and the low levels of trust means that the offset market isn't going mainstream. 50 million tonnes out of global emissions in the billions and billions of tonnes. Trust and transparency, so knowing that the money you're spending goes to, one, a good project, and two, actually to the project, is absolutely crucial. So if you have those two things, as I mentioned when I got up onto the stage, we can make this market meaningful. So I have some hope for the future, and I suspect we won't ever get to the point where you'll have one single price for all offsets, but we will get some standardization, more transparency, more understanding of where that price is. And actually, ultimately, which is what we specialize in, is helping people understand their financial risks. Because if you're offsetting, you need to know what the price of your offset is going to be this year, next year, and in 10 years' time. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you, Louis, for this. We heard now from Louis and the previous speakers that there are a lot of challenges on offsetting. There's risks, there are risks. Transparency is an issue, missing regulation is an issue, but Louis said it well, he has still some hope. So, Gabriel, I'm coming to you. You work for the UN-RED and present UNEP at CORSIA. And, well, there are a lot of discussions going on offsetting, what is good offsetting, what is bad in offsetting. Is there any forming consensus in these forums about what a good offset should look like?
Well, actually, before I go over this slide, when I was listening to Katharina, I was thinking, this is just the characteristic of a good offset. This is not what good offsetting may or may not look like, in the sense that you could have something of really good quality, but that is actually used for an offsetting strategy that actually is not what you want to see. So that's, I think that there is a difference between good offsetting and a good offset. When I see examples like, I don't know, Luis was bringing Shell, I kind of get nervous. And I don't really take a very deep look at the characteristic of the offset, but I'm rather much more concerned about the offsetting strategy of the company. And that I get nervous is really an understatement. But if I forget for a minute about this bigger framework, when we get questions or we get into a dialogue with companies, and the topic of a good offset comes, in a nutshell, we say, okay, well, if we were in your place and we were looking for a good offset, these are the basics you might want to keep in mind. First of all is social and environmental safeguards, and that's a huge package that contains a lot of different things, from participation plans, free, prior, and informed consent for indigenous peoples, gender action plans. You can have different standards or guidelines. We in UN Red use a lot of the Cancun safeguards. The GCF uses the IFC social and environmental safeguards, which are really good. You could follow different options. Something that is important in terms of the legitimacy of the investment in the ground is how the money will be distributed. Luis was talking about making sure the money gets to people, gets to the ground. That's the first step. The second step is that when it is on the ground, it gets distributed in some sort of fair system. Measurement of results, that's very basic. I'm not going to go into that except to say that in the last 10 years, there has been nothing less than a revolution in terms of what you can measure now. 10 years ago, you could see the forest. Today, if you have enough money to pay for, and it's becoming, cheaper along the way, you could see the tree if you want. So that is diminishing the level of uncertainty. Permanence, we tell our partners, you really want to take a look at this in a world of climate change. Remember the fires of this year. Leakage, that's an old topic, still something to pay attention to. If you work at the national or jurisdictional level, which is post-2020, probably a must, leakage is more manageable. And the last two things that have been around for a while, but my impression is that they will become very, very important now post-2020, and if Article 6 hopefully comes online, is additionality. We really advise our partners make sure that this is really additional, and for example, that really wipes out a lot of offsets from all vintages. Nesting and accounting, it's something that projects from the voluntary market they often have this challenge. Project by project, they are really good. Project by project, they are properly measured and accounted for. However, at the jurisdictional or national level, the connection is missing. So far, all of us knew that that was an issue, that we should work on it. But my advice to our partners is that post-2020, nesting and accounting is a must. If you're going to spend money into a voluntary project, you really want to make sure that at the national level the numbers make sense. And conceptually it would be something like, if this room, were a jurisdiction and each square meter would be a project, it wouldn't matter if I account for carbon meter by meter, or I just take, a full measure across the room. That the numbers should be the same, and that is a challenge.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that exposure. So we see, in fact, there is some hope. There will be some evolutions in the coming future. We had some reactions in the audience, so we decided to just have a quick look on the questions that have been raised out of the audience before we eventually go to the next prepared questions, if there's still some time.
Yeah, that was a very spontaneous decision, which now means that I'm trying to figure out how to get this onto the screen. But thanks to my colleagues from GLF who actually know what they do.
You just need to come out.
Okay, so I read the question, I just discover it. So Christine asked, are the voluntary and compliance markets mutually exclusive? What needs to happen to align and consolidate the market? Who would like to answer this question?
Thank you. No, they're not mutually exclusive, but what needs to happen is the rules need to be there to allow the voluntary part into the compliance part. For example, the clean development mechanism was allowed into the EU ETS, but there were two conditions. The first was that they were allowed into the EU ETS up to a certain amount. So on average, it's about 11% of emissions in the EU. And secondly, only certain types of credits are allowed in. So the EU put in some quality constraints and set the boundary. Those quality constraints excluded land use change and forestry. They excluded nuclear. And that was, and then they excluded large hydro that didn't fulfill the criteria of the World Convention on Dams, or didn't have a World Convention on Dams report that gave it an okay. So they restricted them, and then they further restricted industrial gases after a few years because the market became flooded by those industrial gas things that should have happened anyway. And so they took out HFC and some N2O projects. And in the end, the rest of the world didn't take the, I exaggerate side, a lot of the rest of the world didn't take their commitments to the Kyoto Protocol very seriously, and as a consequence, the market for CARs was characterised by there being billions of CARs and only 1.6 billion capacity of the EU ETS to absorb them. And the problem with allowing in the offsets was that there's near infinite offsets available and a limited capacity for that system to take them all on its own in the case of the EU ETS. And what happened to the EU ETS was the price of EUAs crashed to single figures, hung around at €5 for about 5 or 6 years, and caused the rest of the EU not to increase its ambition by becoming more efficient. So they're not mutually exclusive. but the overlap has to be done carefully. And there's one thing that EU ETS and other markets can do, the EU ETS should most certainly do, is award a negative carbon project with an EU allowance. I don't think that's controversial. As long as the reduction is permanent, they should be rewarded with EU allowances if done within the boundaries of the EU and possibly further. And the final point is that the EU ETS covers 45% of the economy. So if you're going to allow offsets in from other parts of the world, or indeed you could allow offsets in from other parts of the EU economy, but really if you captured the entire economy in a emissions trading scheme, you wouldn't need offsets. They would have no place because everyone's in.
Right. I think, Bernard, you have a
just a
reaction?
short comment. Of course, they are not exclusive, but what I observe is different mechanism. In EUTS, it's an obligation for a company that is a large emitter to offset if they cannot reduce. On the voluntary, it's a choice. So I observe that when you have obligation and if you need to source massive volumes of carbon offset, you are looking for price, mainly. In the case of voluntary, you are also looking for price, but you are also looking for quality because it's voluntary and it's usually linked to your brand and to your public exposure, which is quite different. So I think the mechanism of motivation are a bit different. In the case of voluntary, you have partners who are usually sourcing smaller volumes, but they are quite demanding on the quality of the offset because their brand exposure is usually linked to that. Because they choose to do offset, they have no obligation. If for obligation you have to offset whatever, it's different. You have to do it, you don't communicate on it, but you know you need to source as a cheaper cost as possible. In the voluntary, the mechanism is a bit different.
Okay, I see the question moving. So maybe shortly for Louis about the price for carbon and how we could establish one price.
Well, I'd start in the EU, and I would cover all emissions in the EU with the EU emissions trading scheme. The idea that Germany should go it alone and have a carbon tax on carbon from sectors that are not in the EU ETS and then nothing on other sectors, it just seems a bit nutty to me. I mean, how could you have two prices for 1 ton of carbon if you're putting them both in compliance regimes? So the first thing to do is the EU should lead the way, and it should set it should include the entire economy in a cap and trade system. Arguably, a cap and dividend system would be more fair, but that's another question. Of course, the EU is considering border taxes, and those border taxes effectively drag other industry around the world into a pricing regime. And I'm talking, so, I mean, the fantasy, of course, is that the whole world's under one cap and trade system. We've tried that, and the Kyoto Protocol tried that to a large degree, and it didn't work out. And it seems unlikely to work out. But the EU's willing to lead the way, but just not all the way. So that would be the first step. But clearly, the only way to get one price for carbon across the world is to include the global economy in a cap and trade system of some description.
The next question would be, well, given the lack of transparency and regulation in the voluntary carbon offset market, how to even measure the actual net carbon reducing impact of said purchases? That might be Gabriel. Yes. So the question, if I understood it right, is mainly because it's not that transparent. So how can you measure something if you have no clue about it?
Well, no, I think that what Louis was referring to in terms of transparency was the formation of, the process leading to the formation of price. But if you go project by project and you take care of nesting, accounting, measuring it, get a good sense of uncertainties, you can get a relatively decent idea of the tons of carbons that this particular project may reduce. If you actually do that at a jurisdictional level, which is again what I believe it will be almost mandatory post 2020, or at the national level, then there is some effect that is similar to a portfolio effect, in which perhaps hectare by hectare or project by project, you're not exactly sure what that amount of carbon will be, but at the national level, at the jurisdictional level, you can have a fair estimation. So I think that on that side of the equation, at the moment, at the level of jurisdictions or even countries, even accounting for events like fires, it's very well possible to get a decent number with an acceptable level of uncertainty.
Just a note on the carbon pricing. So I absolutely agree there should be a transparency and disclosure on the pricing, let's say, creation. On the other hand, I just wanted to say that let's not treat the compliance markets and the voluntary markets in the same way. Let's not try to put them in the same basket, because under a European emissions trading system, for example, companies are buying emission allowances that are issued by governments. These do not represent 1 ton of CO2 reduction somewhere. Now, what you're buying with offset is you basically sponsoring 1 ton of CO2 reduction through certain methodology in certain project in certain country. So obviously, even if we look at forestry projects, for example, it might be the cost of the reduction in Brazilian Amazon and the cost of a reduction in that particular set of farms in Colombia might be completely different. Now, if we want our buyers to pay a fair price, there will be a difference between the prices, and I'm not absolutely necessarily demanding one price for carbon, because now maybe the fair prices will be between 5 to 10 to 15 euro per ton in certain forestry projects. This is the cost of operating the quality of the impact that they want to achieve or bring. Now, after we get over these initial investments and we get the basics in the nature conservancy right, perhaps in 15 years we will face the cost of carbon reductions be 100 euro or maybe 1,000 euro, because these will be the remaining heavy, hard to abate kind of reductions that we get to, and this will be the cost of reducing 1 ton that's coming from producing steel from hydrogen, whatever. So sometimes it's not that easy to actually try to have a nice chart in the end. Maybe there will be discrepancy, and it's not necessarily a bad thing as long as there is really a transparency on how the price was established and whether it's a fair price, and you really then can claim that you reduced 1 ton or sponsored the reduction in the end. So as long as you can do that, it's fine that there might be differences, because that's what it is. Just a point.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that. So we take the two last questions. How can carbon credits in the forest and land use sector be better aligned with science-based targets and climate-related disclosure? Isn't that a given that this project should just follow these targets?
if I understand the question well, the way I understand this question is how the use of carbon credits could be a meaningful contribution to the science-based targets of X mitigation by 2030. I believe it goes back to what Luis and Catherine was saying. I mean, if we are all going to offset, we're just not going to make it at this end of story. However, real mitigation is going to take a bit of time. Even if you are the CEO of a company that really wants to do it, you may not have the technology now or the financing. So I'm going back to the forest and land use sector, at least forest in terms of avoided mitigation and forest restoration could contribute something around 5.3 gigatons by 2030 and do that on an annual basis. That number could even double if you add other things in the NBS menu. I see that carbon credits can be aligned, can contribute if they are just this stopgap measure that will allow really much needed flow of resources, money, to the field. Even with all the imperfections that I know it will happen in the short run. So if that happens and money starts to flow at scale, while the public pressure, there was a question about how you avoid Shell doing greenwashing. Well, that's public. You just don't go and buy gasoline there. Better you don't buy gasoline. So as public pressure grows and these actions towards real mitigation start to kick in, this stopgap measure in terms of offsetting on the forestry and land use sector can be really a meaningful contribution to the 2030 goals.
Just one word, just a little bit beside this question is, I think we are now very close to the COP that will start in Madrid. And it was mentioned by our colleague here is Article 6 discussion. I think those questions are important, but what will we discuss is the Article 6. It can kill this market. So we have to be very conscious that the way member states will agree on solving this double counting issue is absolutely key for the future of this market. If, as a fund with private investors, I invest in a project in a developing country, for example, for reforesting a region in the country, if it's at the expense of the national inventory, I degrade the national inventory of the country if I export the carbon credit back to my investors. So there is the obvious contradiction if we don't solve this issue of, on the one hand, thanks to the forest that I have contributed to replant, it will enhance the stock, the carbon stock of the country. But on the other hand, there is a private investor that has allowed this forest to be replanted. Today, in the Paris Agreement, this issue is not solved. And it's absolutely urgent to clarify the rules and also to avoid what I see as a very huge opportunity for corruption, frankly. When countries, states, will negotiate the carbon rights, they will, on the one hand, maybe stop any foreign investment, or they will bargain the carbon credit. So we need to define clear rules on accounting and the way it can be traded or invested. In our case, we do not trade, we do not purchase. We invest with upfront funding. That means that we take full risk for the implementation of the project. And as a return, we get carbon credits. But we need a very strong clarification of the rules. Otherwise, investors will be very shy to engage in this type of scheme.
I'll just make one point, because someone asked earlier how to get one price on carbon. So Article 6 most certainly could break the business model of project developers, because if you can't export the things for a profit, then that financing would dry up. But the positive side of Article 6 is that it could actually be the basis for an international carbon market. If you have transparency of the export of carbon reductions from Kenya to whoever is the buyer, then the other countries that are looking to potentially export their carbon credits, or indeed the other countries looking to buy carbon credits, will know what price they're up against. So Article 6 could be a backdoor way to get some semblance of a global carbon price, but we'll see how it goes.
Okay, thank you. Well, as you could see, I was always informed about what's going on outside. You know, I didn't hear it like that. So we will stop this session now. Thank you very much to all the panelists. It was a very, very interesting panel, and I hope for you as well. Thank you for all who attended this workshop, and then we hope that we will see you also now at the final event in room 1. Right.